The tall iron gates of Blackwood Academy stood like silent guards at the entrance to what many considered the finest girls' boarding school in New England. From the road, visitors could see the tips of Gothic towers rising above ancient oak trees, their branches now heavy with autumn leaves. The school looked like something from an old storybook, beautiful, mysterious, and completely cut off from the outside world. Founded in 1897, Blackwood had educated the daughters of America's wealthiest families for generations. Presidents' daughters, heiresses, and future leaders had all walked the stone pathways that crisscrossed the 50-acre campus. The school's motto, carved in Latin above the main hall's entrance, translated to excellence through discipline, words that seemed to hang in the very air of the place. It was early September 2011 when 3 new junior year students arrived for the fall semester. Olivia Caldwell stepped out of her parents' luxury car, her blonde hair catching the sunlight as she looked up at what would be her home for the next 2 years. Behind her, Mai Chen's father was helping unload her carefully packed suitcases, while Gabriela Navarro hugged her mother goodbye near the dormitory entrance. The rooms in Wesley Hall are the best on campus, the student guide was telling them as they lugged their belongings up the ornate staircase. You can see the lake from the 3rd floor. But watch out for the hot water. The pipes are as old as the building, and they make this awful clanging noise at night. The girls nodded, taking in everything from the dark wood paneling to the portraits of stern-faced women who had served as headmistresses over the decades. What they couldn't see were the secrets hiding in plain sight, the sealed doors, the whispers between staff members when students passed, or the way certain topics seemed forbidden during orientation. That first evening, the dining hall buzzed with activity. 200 girls in identical navy blazers and plaid skirts filled long tables beneath a ceiling of exposed wooden beams. Olivia, me, and Gabriela sat together, picking at unfamiliar food and trying not to feel overwhelmed. "My sister went here," a girl with copper hair said from across the table. "She told me all the best hiding spots for when you need to get away from the madness." She lowered her voice. "And which teachers to avoid." "What do you mean?" Gabriela asked, leaning forward. The girl glanced around before answering. "Just that some of them care more about the school's reputation than they do about us." Before she could explain further, Headmistress Wallace approached their table. Tall and elegant in her tailored suit, she had the kind of presence that commanded attention without raising her voice. "Ladies, I trust you're settling in well," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Remember, you represent Blackwood both on and off campus. We expect nothing less than perfection." That night, as they unpacked in their rooms, each girl felt that mixture of excitement and homesickness common to boarding school students. What they didn't know was that the school's picture-perfect surface hid decades of troubling incidents, all carefully buried by an administration skilled at protecting its image. Olivia arranged photos on her desk while her roommate, Lily, chatted about classes. May organized her books alphabetically, already worrying about maintaining her perfect GPA. And Gabriela stood at her window, watching as a groundskeeper locked a small outbuilding that didn't appear on any of the campus maps they'd been given. "What's that building for?" she asked her roommate. "No idea. It's always locked. Some girls say it's just old storage, but there are weird stories about it." Outside, darkness settled over Blackwood Academy. In the administration building, Headmistress Wallace was still working, adding 3 new student files to a cabinet that required a key she kept around her neck. She paused at the window, looking out at the peaceful campus, and made a phone call. "The new girls have arrived," she said quietly. "Yes, everything is proceeding as planned." As lights went out across the dormitories, none of the students could have imagined that within 2 months, their sense of security would be shattered. The prestigious institution would soon become known for something far darker than academic excellence, and 3 ordinary girls would find themselves at the center of a mystery that had been waiting decades to be uncovered. 2 months had passed since the start of the fall semester. The crisp October air swept across Blackwood Academy's campus, scattering red and gold leaves across the stone pathways. Students had settled into their routines, morning classes, afternoon activities, evening study hours, the rhythm of boarding school life becoming second nature. For Olivia Caldwell, that rhythm broke on a Tuesday morning. When the bell rang for morning roll call, her seat remained empty. Her roommate, Lily, glanced at the door repeatedly, expecting Olivia to rush in late with some excuse about oversleeping. "Caldwell?" Mrs. Peterson called again, peering over her reading glasses at the empty chair. "She wasn't in our room this morning," Lily finally said, her voice small in the suddenly quiet classroom. "I thought maybe she went to the library early." Word spread quickly through the student body. By lunchtime, everyone knew Olivia was missing. Her bed hadn't been slept in, but strangely, her phone sat charging on her nightstand. Her wallet, with her ID and credit cards, remained untouched in her desk drawer. Her coat still hung in the closet despite the cold weather outside. She wouldn't just leave without her things. Gabriella insisted as she sat with May in the dining hall, both girls picking at food they had no appetite for. "Something's wrong." May nodded, lowering her voice. "Did you notice how the teachers are acting? Like they're more worried about keeping us quiet than finding Olivia." They weren't wrong. Headmistress Wallace had called an assembly that afternoon, her carefully composed face betraying no real concern. "We have reason to believe that Olivia Caldwell has chosen to leave campus without permission," she told the gathered students, her voice echoing in the chapel. This behavior, while disappointing, is not unheard of among teenagers. The administration is handling the situation, and we expect normal activities to continue. What the headmistress didn't mention was that the school waited a full 48 hours before contacting the local police. When Officer Thomas finally arrived to take a report, he seemed surprised by the delay. "You should have called us immediately," he told Wallace, not bothering to lower his voice as they walked across the quad. "The first 24 hours are crucial in missing persons cases." "Officer, we have protocols for student disciplinary issues," Wallace replied coolly. "We needed to determine this wasn't simply a case of a teenager breaking rules." That evening, police searched Olivia's room. They found her journal tucked between her mattress and box spring, something the school's cursory search had missed. Detective Rivera, a woman with sharp eyes and no patience for institutional stonewalling, flipped through the pages while Lily watched anxiously. "Did Olivia ever mention the old chapel to you?" the detective asked, showing Lily an entry dated just a week before the disappearance. "The old chapel? That building's been closed for years," Lily said, reading Olivia's writing. "Asterisk meeting at the old chapel again tonight. Not sure I should go this time. Something feels off asterisk." Another entry from 3 days before she vanished read, "Asterisk, I feel like I'm being watched. Even when I'm alone in the room. Found another note under my door today asterisk." When the detective asked about these notes, no one had answers. The school insisted there was no access to the old chapel, which had been condemned after structural damage from a storm years ago. Meanwhile, Gabriella and Mai began asking questions of their own. They'd approached other students who had been friendly with Olivia, gathering pieces of a troubling puzzle. "She was acting weird those last few days," said a girl from Olivia's chemistry class. "Really jumpy. She kept looking over her shoulder like she expected someone to be there." Another student mentioned seeing Olivia talking to the groundskeeper, an old man named Walter who rarely spoke to students. "They seemed to be arguing about something," she said. She looked upset. As days stretched into a week with no sign of Olivia, the school attempted to maintain normalcy. Classes continued, assignments were given, and students were discouraged from discussing the disappearance. But beneath the surface, fear had taken root. Girls began traveling in groups. Room doors that had once been left casually open were now locked at night. And small details about the campus seemed suddenly sinister. The way certain areas had no security cameras, how some staff members changed the subject when asked about previous incidents at the school. In their room after lights out, Gabriella confided in her roommate. "I found something weird yesterday. I was in the library archives for a history project, and there was a newspaper clipping from 1985 about a student who went missing from Blackwood. But when I went back today to look at it again, that whole section had been removed." Across campus, in her office, Headmistress Wallace was on the phone, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've contained the situation for now," she said, "but this detective is persistent. She's asking about the old records." A pause. "Yes, I understand what's at stake. It won't happen again." As she hung up, she didn't notice the shadowy figure passing by her window, moving silently toward the dormitories where 200 girls slept, unaware that Olivia was just the beginning. 2 weeks after Olivia vanished, Blackwood Academy tried to force a return to normalcy. The school's stone walls seemed to close in around the students as teachers insisted on continuing lessons, tests, and activities as if nothing had happened. But in the hallways, during moments between classes, girls whispered theories and fears. They found Olivia's hairbrush in the woods, one girl told another. No, they found her bracelet by the lake, countered someone else. The truth was, they hadn't found anything. Detective Rivera had searched the campus grounds, the surrounding forest, and even dragged parts of the lake, but Olivia had simply vanished without a trace. May sat alone in the library, surrounded by open books she wasn't reading. Dark circles had formed under her eyes from nights of lying awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old building. She jumped when someone touched her shoulder. "Sorry," Gabriella said softly, sliding into the chair across from her. "Any news?" May shook her head. "The police were here again this morning. I'd overheard them arguing with Headmistress Wallace. They want to interview all the students, but she's blocking it." Gabriella leaned closer. "I found something. You know how we're not supposed to use our phones after lights out? I broke the rules last night and called my cousin who works at a newspaper. I asked her to look into Blackwood's history." She slid a paper across the table. She found 3 other cases of girls who disappeared from here. One in 1952, one in 1985, and another in 1997. What happened to them? That's the weird part. The 1952 and 1997 cases were officially listed as runaways. The 1985 girl was eventually found. She supposedly had amnesia and was discovered wandering in a town 30 miles away. But she never returned to school, and there was no follow-up story. A teacher walked by, and both girls quickly pretended to study until she passed. "There's more," Gabriella whispered once they were alone again. All 3 girls disappeared in October or November, and all 3 had reported feeling watched or followed in the days before they vanished. The autumn dance was Blackwood's longest-standing tradition. Despite the tension on campus, Headmistress Wallace insisted it continue, telling parents it would help restore a sense of security for the students. Extra security guards were hired, men in dark suits who stood at every door, watching the girls with blank expressions. The gymnasium had been transformed with golden lights and fall decorations. Music played while teachers chaperoned from the edges of the room. May stood with a group of classmates, wearing the black dress her mother had sent specially for the occasion. "Have you seen Gabriella?" she asked a nearby girl. She was talking to Lily near the punch bowl. But when May looked, neither girl was there. She felt a flutter of worry and pushed through the crowd, searching for her friend. She finally spotted Gabriella near the side exit, talking to May's roommate, Rhea. "I've been looking everywhere for you," May said, relief washing over her. Gabriella seemed distracted. "Sorry, I just needed some air. It's too crowded in here." "I know what you mean," Rhea said, fanning herself. "It's so hot. I'm going to step outside for a minute." "I'll come with you," May offered immediately. Rhea shook her head. "No need. I'll just be right outside the door. I'll be back in 5 minutes." They watched her walk toward the exit, where one of the security guards nodded as she passed. The music changed to a faster song, and more girls filled the dance floor. "I don't feel right about this," Gabriella said suddenly. "Something's off." 10 minutes later, May checked her watch. Rhea should be back by now. They went to the door where they'd seen her leave. The security guard was still there, but when they asked about Rhea, he simply said, "No one has gone outside in the last half hour." "That's not true," Gabriella insisted. "Our friend just went out." He nodded at her. The guard's face remained expressionless. "No one has left through this door." Panic rising, they ran to find a teacher. Mrs. Peterson listened to their concerns with growing alarm and immediately began checking all exits. Within 20 minutes, it was confirmed. Rhea was nowhere on campus. Like Olivia before her, she had vanished. This time, the school couldn't contain the chaos. Girls were crying, parents were called, and the police arrived within the hour. Officer Thomas looked grim as he reviewed security footage with Detective Rivera. "The cameras went out," he said, pointing to the timestamp. "There's a 7-minute gap in the recording, right when your friend says she saw Rhea leave." Unlike with Olivia, there was no delay in response this time. Police cars lined the driveway, and officers with flashlights searched the woods surrounding the school. Parents began arriving in the middle of the night to take their daughters home. In the midst of the confusion, Gabriella pulled May into an empty classroom. "Look what I found in my coat pocket," she said, her hand shaking as she held out a folded piece of paper. "Someone must have put it there during the dance." May unfolded it, reading the typed message with growing horror. "You're next. Stop asking questions if you want to stay safe." Outside, a storm had begun, rain lashing against the windows as if trying to get in. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Blackwood's walls, 2 girls were missing, and someone on campus knew exactly what had happened to them. The morning after Raina's disappearance, half the students at Blackwood Academy were gone. Worried parents had arrived through the night to take their daughters home, despite Headmistress Wallace's assurances that the campus was safe. Yellow police tape marked off parts of the grounds, and officers conducted interviews in the dining hall, which stood mostly empty during breakfast. Mai hadn't slept. The room she had shared with Roya felt too big, too quiet without her roommate's gentle snoring. She sat on her bed, staring at the empty mattress across from her, when a knock came at the door. "Detective Rivera wants to see us," Gabriella said when May opened the door. Her friend's face was pale, her usually neat hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She sat up in the library. Detective Rivera was nothing like the local police officers who had first responded to Olivia's disappearance. In her mid-40s, with short, grey-streaked hair and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything, she had been called in from the state police because of her experience with missing persons cases. "I need you to tell me everything," she said once the girls were seated across from her at a corner table. "Not just about your friends, but about anything strange you've noticed since arriving at Blackwood." For the next hour, they talked. About Olivia's journal entries mentioning the old chapel. About the newspaper clippings Gabriella had found regarding previous disappearances. About the threatening note left in Gabriella's coat pocket. The detective took detailed notes, occasionally stopping them to ask questions. "You mentioned Olivia seemed anxious in the days before she vanished. Did Rita show any similar behavior?" May thought for a moment. She was spending a lot of time in the library. She said she was researching something for history class, but whenever I asked about it, she changed the subject. "And you said the security cameras went out during the exact window when Ruya disappeared." Rivera looked up from her notes. "That's not a coincidence. Do you think someone inside the school is involved?" Gabriella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The detective's silence was answer enough. Later that day, classes were cancelled. Most teachers were busy helping police or dealing with concerned parents. Me and Gabriella used the opportunity to search Ruya's belongings, hoping to find some clue about what she had been researching. "Look at this," May said, pulling a folded paper from between the pages of Ruya's history textbook. It was a photocopy of an old yearbook page from 1985, with several faces circled in red pen. Why would she be interested in students from almost 30 years ago? Gabriella looked closer. "Wait, I recognize this woman." She pointed to a teacher in the background of the photo. "That's Mrs. Peterson, but she looks so young." "Mrs. Peterson has been teaching here since the 80s, May asked, surprised. "We need to talk to her," Gabriella decided. They found Mrs. Peterson in her empty classroom, grading papers as if it were any normal school day. The English teacher looked up when they entered, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Girls, you should be in your dormitory," she said, but her usual strictness seemed softened by concern. "Mrs. Peterson, we need to ask you something," Gabriella began, placing the yearbook page on the desk. "You were teaching here in 1985 when another girl went missing." The color drained from the teacher's face. She quickly got up to close the classroom door before returning to her desk. "Where did you get this?" she asked quietly. "Rhea had it. She was researching something before she disappeared," May explained. "We think it's connected to what happened to her and Olivia." Mrs. Peterson seemed to age before their eyes, her shoulders slumping as she sank into her chair. "I should have spoken up years ago," she said, more to herself than to them. "But after what happened to Linda—" "Linda?" Gabriella prompted. "Linda Chen, a teacher who tried to report what she knew in 1997. Mrs. Peterson's voice shook slightly. She was found dead in her car a week later. The police called it an accident. The girls exchanged alarmed glances. What did she know? May asked. About the covenant. Mrs. Peterson looked at them directly now. A group of alumni and board members who've controlled this school since its founding. They protect each other no matter what, and they silence anyone who threatens their power. Like students who discover something they shouldn't, Gabriella said slowly. The teacher nodded. The girl who disappeared in 1985 was getting too close to the truth about financial irregularities. The one in 1997 had evidence of abuse by a prominent board member. And Olivia and Ria? May asked. I don't know what they found, but it must have been damaging. Mrs. Peterson pulled a key from around her neck. There's a room in the basement archives where they keep the real records, everything that gets erased from the official history. I've been collecting evidence for years, waiting for the right time. A noise in the hallway made them all freeze. Footsteps approached, then passed by. It's not safe to talk here, Mrs. Peterson whispered. Meet me at the old chapel tonight at midnight. There's an entrance to the tunnels there. I'll show you everything I've gathered. As the girls left the classroom, they didn't notice the figure watching from around the corner. Nor did they see the same figure following Mrs. Peterson as she hurried across campus later that afternoon. They couldn't have known that by the time midnight arrived, their alley would already be gone and the danger closer than ever. Darkness had settled over Blackwood Academy like a heavy blanket. Most rooms were dark, with only a few scattered lights glowing from windows where worried students still couldn't sleep. The campus felt abandoned, with half the student body gone and an unnatural quiet hanging in the air. May checked her watch for the fifth time, 11:45 p.m. 15 minutes until they were supposed to meet Mrs. Peterson at the old chapel. I've been trying to call her all evening, Gabriella whispered as they huddled near the window of May's room. She's not answering her phone. Maybe she turned it off? We should still go, May replied, though doubt crept into her voice. The note they'd found in Ria's book had been hidden for a reason. What if someone had seen them talking to Mrs. Peterson? Getting out of the dorm wasn't easy. After Ria's disappearance, security had been doubled. Guards patrolled the hallways, and the main doors were locked at 9 instead of the usual 10. But Gabriella had discovered weeks ago that the fire exit at the end of the east wing had a faulty alarm. They slipped out into the cold night air, their breath forming small clouds in front of their faces. The old chapel stood on the far side of campus, separated from the main buildings by a small wooded area. Its stone walls were covered in ivy, and its stained glass windows were dark and empty. A chain hung across the main entrance, with a sign declaring Sion DNNED, Du NOTNTR in faded letters. I don't see Mrs. Peterson, May whispered, looking around nervously. Let's wait a few minutes. She might be inside already. They stood in the shadows of a large oak tree, watching for any movement. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere nearby. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Something's wrong, Gabriella finally said. She wouldn't just not show up. May nodded, hugging herself against the chill. Maybe we should go back. Wait, Gabriella pointed to the side of the chapel. There's another entrance over there. See that low door? It looks like it might lead to a basement or something. The small wooden door was partially hidden behind overgrown bushes, its existence not obvious unless you were looking for it. Unlike the main entrance, it had no chain or warning sign. And most telling of all, the padlock that should have secured it hung open. Someone's been here, May whispered. They approached cautiously, every snapping twig under their feet sounding impossibly loud in the quiet night. Gabriella reached for the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stone steps leading down into darkness. I have a flashlight on my phone, May said, her voice shaky but determined. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow passage that smelled of damp earth and old stone. They descended slowly, each step taking them deeper underground. At the bottom, the passage widened into what must have once been a storage room. Dust-covered boxes and forgotten furniture lined the walls. Look at this, Gabriella said, pointing to the floor. The layer of dust had been disturbed, showing clear footprints leading to the far wall. Someone's been down here recently. They followed the footprints to what appeared to be a solid stone wall. But upon closer inspection, they noticed a thin line running from floor to ceiling. It's a door, May realized, running her fingers along the almost invisible seam. But how does it open? Gabriella's flashlight beam caught something metallic nearby, an old-fashioned wall sconce. When she touched it, it moved slightly to the right. With a grinding noise, the stone wall began to shift, revealing a dark tunnel beyond. "The tunnels Mrs. Peterson mentioned," Gabriella whispered. "They're real." The passage beyond was different from the chapel basement, clearly man-made with brick walls and a low ceiling. Metal pipes ran along one side, and old electric lights hung from above, though they no longer worked. "These must run under the whole campus," May said, her voice echoing slightly. "But why would they build them?" Mrs. Peterson said they were from Prohibition times. Places like this often had secret ways to move alcohol. They moved forward cautiously, their phone flashlights creating shifting shadows on the walls. The tunnel branched off in several directions, creating a maze that could easily confuse anyone unfamiliar with its layout. "We should mark our path," May suggested, taking a piece of chalk from her pocket that she normally used for math classes. She made a small mark on the wall at each turn they took. After about 10 minutes of walking, they came to a heavy metal door. Unlike the rest of the tunnels, this looked newer with a modern lock. Most surprising of all, it was slightly ajar. Gabriella pushed it open slowly, revealing a small room filled with filing cabinets and a desk. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak yellow light over what looked like an underground office. "Someone's been using this recently," May said, pointing to a coffee mug on the desk with liquid still inside. Gabriella moved to the filing cabinets and pulled open a drawer. Inside were folders labeled with years going back decades. She pulled out the one marked 1985 and opened it. "These are records about the girl who disappeared that year," she said, scanning the pages quickly. "Look, hospital reports, police statements, even photos. Things that were never in the official investigation." May had opened another drawer and pulled out a folder labeled Student Observations. Inside were pages of notes about current students, including Olivia and Ria. "Someone was watching them," she said, her voice breaking. "There are details about their daily routines, notes about their phone calls and letters home. Even." A noise from the tunnel made them both freeze, footsteps growing closer. "Hide," Gabriella hissed, quickly shoving the folders back into the cabinets. They ducked behind a large storage shelf just as the door swung fully open. A beam of light swept the room, and a familiar voice spoke into the silence. "I know you're in here." "There's nowhere to run." The groundskeeper Walter stood in the doorway, his usually stooped figure now straight and menacing, a set of keys jangling from his belt. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows of the tunnel, stood another figure they couldn't quite make out. "We've been watching you girls," Walter continued, stepping further into the room. "Just like we watched your friends. You should have minded your own business." The groundskeeper's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the hidden room. May's heart pounded so hard she was certain he could hear it. Next to her behind the storage shelf, Gabriella had gone completely still, barely breathing. "Come out now," Walter called, his voice echoing off the brick walls. "Make it easier on yourselves." From somewhere deeper in the tunnels, a voice called out. "Did you find them?" May recognized that voice instantly. Headmistress Wallace. The elegant, composed woman who had welcomed them to Blackwood now sounded cold and impatient. "They're in here somewhere," Walter replied. "The dust shows fresh footprints." May's mind raced. There was only one exit from the room, the door where Walter stood. They were trapped unless. She squeezed Gabriella's hand and nodded toward the ceiling. Above them, a ventilation grate was barely visible in the shadows. It might be big enough for them to fit through. While Walter moved toward the filing cabinets, checking behind each one, Gabriella carefully reached up and tested the grate. It moved slightly. Years of neglect had loosened the screws holding it in place. "Check under the desk," came Headmistress Wallace's voice, closer now. They couldn't have gone far. With Walter's back turned, May and Gabriella worked silently to remove the grate. Years of dust rained down on them, and May had to press her sleeve against her mouth to keep from coughing. Just as Walter bent to look under the desk, Gabriella pushed the grate completely free. With strength born from terror, she pulled herself up into the narrow vent shaft, then reached down to help May. They had barely replaced the grate when Walter stood up and swept his flashlight directly over their hiding spot. Finding nothing, he cursed under his breath. "They're not here," he called out. "They must have gone down the east tunnel." "Find them," Headmistress Wallace ordered as she appeared in the doorway. In the weak light, her face looked like a mask, all sharp angles and dark shadows. "We can't let them leave the grounds with what they know." The two adults hurried out, their footsteps fading as they headed down one of the branching tunnels. In the tight confines of the ventilation shaft, May and Gabriella waited several minutes before daring to speak. "We need to get to Detective Rivera," Gabriella whispered. "Show her what we found." "How?" "We don't even know where this vent leads," May replied. They began crawling forward, the metal duct barely wide enough for their shoulders. Dust and cobwebs clung to their hair and clothes as they inched along in near-total darkness, using only the dim light from a single phone to guide them. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they came to another grate. Through it, they could see a small room with cleaning supplies, a janitor's closet inside the main school building. "I think we're in the administration wing," May whispered as they carefully removed the grate and lowered themselves to the floor. They cracked open the closet door. The hallway beyond was dark and empty. A wall clock showed 1:30 a.m. "Let's find a phone," Gabriella suggested. "Call Detective Rivera directly." They moved silently down the hall toward the main office, where they knew there would be a phone. Just as they turned the corner, they froze. Light spilled from beneath the office door, and voices could be heard from inside. "Becoming a problem," a man's voice was saying. "2 missing girls is bad enough. We don't need police digging any deeper." "Everything is under control," came Headmistress Wallace's voice. "Once we find the other two, this will all blow over just like before." "The Covenant has protected this school for generations," the man replied. "We can't let a few nosy teenagers destroy everything we've built." Me and Gabriella exchanged wide-eyed glances. They needed to hear more, to gather evidence, but staying put was dangerous. Just as they were about to retreat, May's phone vibrated loudly in her pocket. Inside the office, the voices fell silent. "What was that?" the man asked. "Someone's outside," Headmistress Wallace replied. Heart pounding, May grabbed Gabriella's hand, and they ran back the way they had come. Behind them, the office door flew open, spilling light into the hallway. "There they are," Walter's voice boomed as he emerged from a side corridor, cutting off their escape route. With no other choice, they ducked into the nearest room, the computer lab. The door had no lock, so they pushed a heavy desk against it and looked frantically for another way out. "The windows," Gabriella said, rushing toward them. But outside, they could see 2 security guards patrolling the grounds. "We're trapped," May whispered. Just then, Gabriella's phone lit up with an incoming call. Detective Rivera's name flashed on the screen. "Hello." Gabriella answered quietly, her voice shaking. "Where are you?" The detective asked urgently. "Mrs. Peterson never showed up for our meeting, and her apartment looks like there was a struggle." "We're in the computer lab in the main building," Gabriella said quickly. "Headmistress Wallace is involved, and Walter the groundskeeper. They're coming after us right now." Outside the lab, they could hear footsteps approaching, and Wallace's voice giving orders. "Listen carefully," Detective Rivera said. "I'm 5 minutes from campus with backup. Can you get to the front entrance?" "They're between us and the main doors," May said, taking the phone. "But wait, there's something else. We found tunnels under the school, and files about all the missing girls, going back decades. It's some group called the Covenant. They've been covering up things for years." A loud thud came from the door as someone tried to force it open. "Use the computer," Detective Rivera instructed. "Send me photos of everything you found, and stay on the line." With shaking hands, Gabriella used her phone to email the pictures she'd taken of the files, while May held the desk against the door. "Hurry," May urged as the door shuddered under increasing pressure. Just as Gabriella hit send, the glass window beside them shattered. Walter's face appeared in the opening, reaching through to unlock the window. "They're breaking in," Gabriella cried into the phone. "Third floor," Detective Rivera said quickly. "Jump to the gymnasium roof. It's right below you. We're coming in now." With no time to think, they pushed away from the window just as Walter climbed through. They ran to the hallway door, shoved the desk aside, and burst through, directly into the path of Headmistress Wallace. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The headmistress's perfect composure had cracked, revealing something dark and desperate beneath. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she said, her voice eerily calm despite the situation. "The Covenant protects its own. Always has, always will." In the distance, they could hear sirens approaching the school. The wail of police sirens cut through the night, growing louder as they approached Blackwood Academy. Headmistress Wallace's face hardened as she heard them, but she didn't move from blocking the girl's path. "It's over," Gabriella said, clutching her phone tightly. "We sent everything to Detective Rivera. The files, the photos, everything about the Covenant." Something flashed in the headmistress's eyes, maybe fear, maybe anger. Behind her, footsteps pounded down the hallway as Walter and another security guard approached. "Take them to the east tunnel entrance," Wallace ordered sharply. "We need to get them off campus before the police arrive." Walter reached for May's arm, but she jerked away. "Where are our friends?" she demanded. "What did you do with Olivia and Rhea?" "They're safe," Wallace replied coldly. "Safer than you'll be if you don't cooperate." Just then, the lights in the hallway flickered, then blazed to full brightness. Someone had turned on the main power. From the direction of the front entrance came shouts and the sound of heavy doors being forced open. "Police, nobody move." Taking advantage of the momentary distraction, Gabriella grabbed May's hand and they bolted down a side hallway. Behind them, Wallace shouted orders, but the approaching police were causing confusion. The girls ducked into the stairwell, taking the steps two at a time toward the third floor. "The gymnasium roof," May panted as they ran. Like Rivera said, they'd burst through the third-floor exit and raced to the windows overlooking the gym's flat roof. Through the glass, they could see police cars with flashing lights filling the circular driveway below. Officers were swarming into the building. "We're going to have to break it," Gabriella said, looking around for something heavy. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and was about to swing it when the stairwell door slammed open. Walter stood there, his usually stooped posture now straight and menacing. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, advancing slowly toward them. May backed against the window. "Why are you doing this? Why hurt innocent students?" "Innocent?" Walter laughed harshly. "Your friend Olivia was digging into financial records she had no business seeing. And Rhea found old yearbooks that should have stayed buried. The Covenant protects its own. That's how it's always been." "Where are they?" Gabriella demanded again. Walter's face twisted into something almost like a smile. "Where no one will ever find them, just like the others over the years." Rage and fear surged through May. Without thinking, she lunged forward, pushing Walter with all her strength. Caught off guard, he stumbled backward, crashing into a display case. Glass shattered around him as he fell to the floor. "Now," May shouted. Gabriella swung the fire extinguisher against the window. The glass cracked but held. She swung again, harder, and this time it shattered outward. Cold night air rushed in as they carefully climbed through the broken window onto the sloped roof below. The gymnasium roof was slippery with morning dew. They inched their way across it, trying to reach the side where a drainpipe might offer a way down. Below them, more police cars were arriving. There, Gabriella pointed to a ladder bolted to the side of the building, likely used by maintenance workers. Just as they reached it, a window above them crashed open. Headmistress Wallace leaned out, her perfect hair now disheveled, her eyes wild with fury. "You have no idea what you've done," she shouted. "The Covenant has protected this school for generations. We've built careers, shaped futures." "You've hurt innocent people," May called back, helping Gabriella onto the ladder. "And now everyone will know." They were halfway down the ladder when Detective Rivera spotted them from below. "Stay there," she called, rushing toward them with two uniformed officers. "We've got you." As their feet touched the ground, May felt her knees go weak with relief. Rivera hurried them toward a police car, away from the chaos of officers streaming into the building. "We found Mrs. Peterson," the detective told them once they were safely inside. "She's in the hospital, but she'll be okay. They attacked her when she tried to gather evidence against them." "But what about Olivia and Rita?" Gabriella asked desperately. "Walter said they were hidden somewhere no one would find them." Rivera's face turned grim. "We're searching the entire campus, including the tunnels. If they're here, we'll find them." Dawn was breaking over Blackwood Academy when the call came through on Rivera's radio. Officers had found something in a sealed room off the main tunnel beneath the old chapel. Rivera instructed the girls to stay in the car while she ran toward the building. The next hour passed in agonizing slowness. More police cars arrived. An ambulance raced up the driveway, its lights flashing but siren silent. Then another. Finally, Rivera returned to the car. The exhaustion on her face had been replaced by something else, a cautious relief. "We found them," she said simply. "Olivia and Rhea. They're alive." Tears streamed down Me's face as Gabriella grabbed her hands tightly. "They were being kept in a sealed room in the tunnels," Rivera explained. "Drugged to keep them compliant, but otherwise unharmed. The doctors are with them now, but they should recover fully." "And the Covenant?" Gabriella asked. "We've arrested Headmistress Wallace, Walter, and 2 board members who were on campus. Based on the files you found and Mrs. Peterson's testimony, we're issuing warrants for at least a dozen more people, former administrators, wealthy alumni, even a state judge who helped bury previous investigations." In the growing light, they could see students being led from the dormitories to waiting buses. Parents were arriving in a steady stream, running toward their daughters with open arms. "It was never about protecting the school," May said quietly. "It was about protecting themselves." Rivera nodded. Power and money. They were embezzling school funds, covering up misconduct, using their positions to benefit themselves, all while presenting a perfect image to the world. Anyone who threatened that image simply disappeared. 3 months later, Blackwood Academy remained closed, its future uncertain. The scandal had made national headlines. Century-old conspiracy at elite boarding school exposed by teenage students. The trials were just beginning, with dozens of former Covenant members facing charges ranging from kidnapping to obstruction of justice. Olivia and Rhea were recovering at home with their families. The physical effects of their captivity had faded, though the emotional scars would take longer to heal. But they were alive, and that was what mattered most. On a bright spring afternoon, May and Gabriella sat in a cafe in town across from Detective Rivera and Mrs. Peterson, whose arm was still in a sling from her encounter with Walter. "The state is considering turning Blackwood into a public school," Rivera told them, sliding a newspaper across the table. "Open to everyone, not just the wealthy and connected." Mrs. Peterson smiled faintly. "After 30 years, it feels strange to think of never going back there. But perhaps that's for the best." "What about the other girls?" Gabriella asked. "The ones who disappeared in previous decades?" Rivera's face grew serious. "We're reopening all those cases. It may take time, but we'll find out what happened to every single one of them. They deserve justice too." As they left the cafe, stepping into the warm sunshine, May felt a weight lifting that she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Blackwood's perfect facade had hidden terrible secrets, but the truth had finally come out. "You know," she said to Gabriella as they walked down the street, "I think we might have just decided my college major." "What's that?" "Investigative journalism," May replied with a small smile. "There are still a lot of hidden truths out there waiting to be found." Behind them, the distant silhouette of Blackwood Academy stood against the blue sky, its dark secrets exposed at last, no longer able to harm the innocent.